So for this week's video, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be going through the steps to create a sword fight between two figures. Now, I'm going to do something a little bit different, and that's show kind of my process for figuring out the problems and the solutions to get to our finished product. A lot of times when watching these videos, it seems like someone knows exactly what to do, does it, and it works the first time, which typically is not the case when trying to figure out something new between Blender and Unity. So the problems in this case are that I have my two figures. One is swinging a sword, the other is trying to block that sword. So what I need to figure out is how to detect when I have a collision what I've actually collided with, whether I've collided with the sword of the opposing player or whether I've contacted his body. So let's dive in and we'll go through the steps one at a time, and some of the steps may not work and some of the steps will until we get to our finished product. So the first thing we're going to do is create our characters in Blender. So I'm using Blender and Unity to do all this work. So the first thing we do is we're going to create our characters in Blender. Now I've already made the characters, and if you are unsure how to do this, making armatures, making animations, you can go to my other videos. I put some of the links in this video, and you can take a look at those, because I'm not going to go through all the steps in order to create the character animations. I'll kind of go through what I've done and how we're going to be using that in Unity. So the first thing I did was I created this basic mesh character, and what I did is I made it in a collection over here, and then what I did is I copy and pasted that collection. So you just right click, duplicate collection, because I need two characters and I want them to be different colors. Because as you see, we have good guy, which is of course green, because good guys are always green. And if we hide him and we show our bad guy, of course the bad guy is red, because red somehow is evil. Not sure why, but that's typically what we use for bad guys. So I have my character, I have my basic armature, and what I have is he's holding a sword here, and I have a bone that's specifically set to be part of that sword. Now I moved the mesh a little bit. It doesn't line up directly inside the sword, but that doesn't really matter. It's up in the direction of the sword, so I can animate the sword by animating that bone. So let's go into the animations to kind of show how that works. So if we go into animation, what I have is, of course, my classic T-pose. Of course, we always need a T-pose. And then I have a couple of animations I made. I made us two different swings and two different blocks. So block 1 will block swing 1. Block 2 will block swing 2. So let's go and just take a quick look at swing 1. It took a while in order to get the swing 1 to indicate what kind of swing he's going to do. Because, of course, when I'm playing the game, if I integrated this into a game, I would need to be able to somehow know what kind of swing is coming at me. And so you want some kind of tell to give the player a chance to know what swing is coming at him. So if we look at this swing, see it basically goes, his arm raises up, comes down, slashes across, kind of from top down. So I want a block that's going to block the sword from coming down on top of me. If I look at swing 2, I made it very different. Swing 2 is going to go, his arm's going to come out to the side, and it's going to go kind of across his belly. So we have two different swings. And if I go to block 1, that is going to raise his sword up and block it from being chopped down on. And if I go to block 2, it is going to kind of block it from coming across. And remember that the player or the guy who's swinging is going to be coming from right to left. They both hold the sword in their right hand. So I want to bring the sword over to my left in order to block the sword coming across. And getting them to line up was not that easy. It took me a number of tries in order to get it. And maybe I could have done it in Blender. I was bringing them into Unity. I would run it, and typically they would kind of miss. Also, how far to reach out in order to collide with the character. And getting all those takes a bit of trial and error. But I got all those done. And then I also needed one that when his body is hit, we want to do an animation. So it just does 2 steps here that he kind of flails forward, his arms go back. Obviously you can do whatever you want when he's hit, whether you might want to have an animation for when he's just hit seriously, is almost dead, and then maybe falls down when he dies. So we have our 2 characters. We have our animations. Go back to T-pose, go back to layout. So then what we need to do, of course, is to export these to Unity. So of course we select all the items, select our sword, because our sword is a separate object in this case. And of course you go in, you export FBS, and you pick where you want it to go to. Of course, we always click selected objects, apply transform, and then of course click to export. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go into Unity, and since we have our characters and they've been exported to Unity, and again, some previous videos go through this step by step in a lot of detail. If you want to see how to export into Unity and get everything correct and drag it into a scene, you can see some of my other links to some of my other videos. Now let's go into Unity. So here we are in Unity. We have our 2 characters that I've exported and brought into Unity. And if we go into this imports folder, this is where I brought them into. So you can see that we have our bad guy with sword and we have our good guy with sword. There's some other items in here from previous tutorials if you watch those. So I'm using the same project really and building on it for all these tutorials. So what we do is we see our armature T-pose. We can see all of the different animations that we've created. Now, the bad guy doesn't have the block 1 and block 2 because I didn't import him after I added those. First I did the swings, I brought them in, got those working. Then I brought in the blocks when I added the blocks to the good guy. Because the bad guy is going to swing his sword, the good guy is going to block. So I will be controlling the good guy blocking the sword, and the computer will be controlling the bad guy swinging the sword. So what we have is, of course, what we had to do is I did not want to run these full speed, so I have adjusted that. Of course, we don't adjust it here, we adjust it in the animation controller. So I had to make an animation controller for each the bad guy and one for the good guy. Again, if you're unsure how to do that, my other videos go through that in detail of bringing in animations, creating controllers, and hooking that all up. So we have our 2 controllers, and if we look at the bad guy controller, essentially is just going to have 2 animations that are going to run, either swing 1 or swing 2. We have a Boolean that's going to control swing 1. So if I click that, we can see when swing 1 is true, we're going to run the swing 1 animation, and then when it's false, we're going to go back to the ready state. And something important is I changed the speed of this. Now I played around with this, and when they run full speed, it happens pretty quick. Too quick to even react to, at least for me. Just playing around with it. And so I set the speed at 0.2. When I set it any slower, I ran into some other timing issues. I'm not sure why, but I did play around with the animation, the number of steps of my animation in Blender, and the speed of my animation here. So you could have just 2 steps in Blender, really, if it's a simple animation, and just run the speed really slow. You could expand that to 10 frames in Blender, and it's going to run at 1/5 of the speed. So really, this speed is going to say how fast to run through all the frames that I've brought in on my animation from Blender. So it's a combination of this speed and the number of frames determines how fast your animation is going to play. So in this case, I played around with it, and 0.2 was what I used. I was thinking that I was going to stop the animation using my speed multiplier. If you watched my other video on the robot jumping down, I used the speed to pause the animation. In this case, I don't really need to pause the animation because when the sword hits either the body or the other sword, I really just want to stop the animation and go back to the ready state. So don't really need that, but I kind of threw it in there just in case. And of course, then we have swing 2 that really does the same thing. I have a swing 2 boolean here. And if we go back to the good guy with sword controller, we see we have block 1 because he's going to want to either run the block animation, the block 2 animation, or if he was hit, he's going to want to play that hit animation if the bad guy's sword actually hit him. So we have our animations hooked up to our animation controller. And now what we need to do is figure out how am I going to determine if the bad guy's sword hit his body or hit his sword. So my first idea was to create a collision rectangle or box and attach one to the body and one to the sword. So if we select him, we can see that. We can see the green box. So I have one on his body. When I made it too far out, sometimes when his sword went to block it, it would actually strike his collision rectangle of his body, and I didn't want that. But you'll notice that when I selected my guy, my box here is not attached to the character. It is attached to part of the character. Because of course my character, if I go over here, you can see is made up of an armature, the good guy mesh, that's the mesh, and the sword. So there's actually 2 different meshes that are part of this. And I want to make sure that my collision box is attached to the guy and a different one to the sword. So how to do that? Well, if I come into what I've done is I've dragged and made a prototype of the character, and I copy it into my meshes. So here, if I go to my bad guy with sword, I can open the prefab here. And then if you'll notice when I select the bad guy, the mesh itself, I added this box collider to the mesh. And of course, I edited the mesh. And my bad guy, I didn't adjust the collision box. And really, the bad guy doesn't need a collision box because the good guy doesn't strike back, at least in this demo. All right. So how do I attach a box collider to the sword? Well, I go in here, and what I want is I want the box collider for the sword to move when his sword moves. So I want to attach it to the sword. Now I do not attach it to the sword mesh because the sword mesh, the position of it technically doesn't change. When animations are run on the armatures, and the armatures simply transform or change the position of the mesh that it's attached to. So it's the armature that the Unity engine actually animates and knows the position of. So what I want to do is I want to attach the box collider to the bone that is part of the sword. Now, unfortunately, I did not name that bone correctly. I forgot to go back and change it, but I didn't fix it here because I'm going to show you the problem and why names are important. As you can see, there's a lot of names over here for all of the different bones. There's a fair number of them in my animation. Now I know from playing around with this that it ended up, the sword one ended up being the hand right 001. And the reason is I extruded the hand R, right? And the default, it just tacked this 001 onto it. And I forgot to go back and rename it. I could probably rename it now, but not a big deal. I know what it is. It's hand R001. And you can see that when I select that, I have attached a box collider to this bone itself. So again, once I have that selected, obviously you just do add component. I can add any component to any part of my character. So I have my box collider on my sword. I have my box collider on my character. We select him, we can see that. I did the same thing for the good guy. He has his one on his body and his on his sword. So now I can run the animation and I can try to detect whether or not the sword hit his body or the other sword. So the question is how do I know which one it got hit? So again, that takes a little investigation, a little trial and error. And let's kind of go through the process I have been going through to try to figure that out and see some of the results. So the first thing we need to do is we need to have code that is controlling these guys. So if we look at the good guy with sword, I have made a script that's called guy with sword. I made this one first and of course didn't name it specifically enough. It's actually good guy with sword. But once you make a script, I didn't want to go through the pain of renaming the scripts and tying everything together is kind of a hassle. So I just left it guy with sword, and then my bad guy with sword has a script is called bad guy with sword. I try to really keep all my names the same in order to remember what the script name is versus what the controller name is versus what the mesh name is. Makes it a lot easier. And again, good names are important, especially as you start building out your game. You're going to have lots of different characters, meshes, controllers, animations, scripts. And so good naming is always important to keep track of everything. So we'll just drag this guy on the screen and we'll take a look at what my scripts look like. Pretty simple. What guy with sword's going to do is I am going to get a key down, and what I'm going to do is say I'm just going to assign the A key to run block 1, and I'm going to use the S key for running block 2. Of course, I need to get the component animator, and I assign it to my variable animator here. I usually always like to do constants for strings instead of embedding the strings in my code. One, it makes a good place to put it right at the top of your script. And two, if this ever changes for some reason, I have one place to change it instead of multiple in my code. So always a good idea to do that. And then what I've done is I haven't decided whether I want to use the collision or a trigger. And we'll see kind of the difference between those two, and A, what it gives you, and B, really how the characters react when we use a trigger versus a collider. There's one thing that I found in this case is that if you looked at my previous videos, I went through how to use animation events. And at first I thought I wanted to use an animation event because when the sword swing reaches the end, I want to set the either the swing or the block variables back to false. So it goes back to the reset, his normal reset pose. And I've discovered this code, which is handy, is that you can attach events directly through code, which is handy. So this is going to go through, it's just going to run through all the animations and attach an event. And the event attachment is just a function. So we have an animation start handler, which I don't really need at this point, but just threw that in there just in case. And I have an animation complete handler, which I want, and the name of the animation is passed in. And so if it's armature block 1, I'm going to set the block 1 back to false. Armature block 2, I'm going to set block 2 back to false. And if I've done the hit, I'm going to set the got hit back to false. So this is pretty much the only code I got. So if we look at what bad guy with sword is going to do is, again, I need my animator. I have my two variables for my swings, swing 1 and swing 2. I thought I would need two variables here. They're currently unused. Of course, I get my animator component in the startup, and when I update, what I'm going to do is I am going to swing every X number of seconds. And that is going to be set currently to 4 seconds. So every 4 seconds, I'm going to take a swing. And the swing I'm going to do, I'm going to pick a random number between 0 and 9. And I put it in for greater than 0 just for test. So he's always going to do swing 2 in this case. If I set this greater than 4, then half the time he would do swing 1 and half the time he would do swing 2. But we're just going to work on swing 2 for now. Make it easy. And then, of course, I have my same functions in order to hook up my animation complete. And you'll notice I was inconsistent, and this tripped me up for a minute or two, is that I put a space between, and I misspelled swing, between swing 1 and swing 2. And consistency in naming is also important. If you're going to make a space between the name and the number, always do it or never do it, because again, it can mess you up, and always takes a while to catch those little errors like that. So again, consistent naming is always good. And you'll notice that I did not make a constant for this because I've been working on it. I normally always do, but this is just hard-coded in the code. So we have our script set up. So we're going to have the bad guy is going to swing every 4 seconds, and the good guy is going to try to run his block when we hit the A and the S key. So some of the things I messed around with because I ran into problems, and let's see the first problem. So we have our good guy is going to be swinging his sword. They both have masses of 1, of course, on the rigid body. Another thing I ran into is that collision boxes, none of the collisions work unless you have a rigid body. You have to have a rigid body, and which means that it's going to run the physics engine. So when these guys collide, it's going to apply the physics to the character. So let's see what happens when I run this. We will let it run here. Oop. And he fell down. And the reason he fell down is my bad guy's character actually struck, right, this character, and his sword didn't stop, right? Let's just go to a scene, and we can look at it at different angles. Every once in a while he did swing 2, or actually swing 1, because the random number was 0. So we can see the animation looks pretty decent. We can watch him go, and of course my good guy's falling down. So the problem with that is that when he got struck, the physics engine added a force to him and he fell down. Let's stop him. So the first thing I tried was, what if I make his mass really heavy? Because if he's really heavy, the sword won't make him fall down. So let's see what happens when we do that. Go to the scenes, better angle. Well, it doesn't look like he fell down, but the problem is it's not actually striking his. See, you notice the sword is not even going through his box, which is a problem. So let's move him a little closer. Let's run it again. Nope, still not doing it. So let's move him a little closer. I think it's just going through his head, which is part of the problem. Whoa. So now it did strike it. You'll see what happened now is that poor bad guy fell over, and now my good guy fell over. So the issue with using the collisions is that it's going to apply the physics. And maybe if I put in my code to actually have the sword stop once it collided, that would be fixed, but maybe not. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to try to figure out what some of the other options are. All right, so what we're going to try to do is see when we get that collision, what information do we get from the collision to try to figure out who he hit with. We've seen one problem with using the collision versus a trigger, and that is that the physics engine is going to interact with the characters. So maybe when I stop the sword, it'll stop, maybe it won't. But first of all, I have to solve the problem of how do I know what it hit? So I know whether to show that hit animation or not, and maybe show some type of animation or something that shows that the sword's hit. And of course, if I'm making a game, there would be some point value type thing calculated at the same time. But my problem is right now is I don't even know, I can't even tell what it hit. So what I have here on my screen is I have my code here on half the screen and my Unity half the screen. Typically I have two monitors, which of course I can't capture on video, but I highly recommend if you're doing any amount of game development, it's very handy having your code run on the other monitor while you have Unity on the other one. So let's hit run, and we'll see I have a breakpoint here. I'm using Visual Studio 2020 Community Edition. Highly recommend that. It works really well. And I guess I use it a lot. I've used it for many years, so I'm pretty familiar with it. But anyway, I have some breakpoints here set. I'm going to click Attach to Unity. So I will stop at the breakpoint when I hit a collision. We'll see this collision enter there, and let's hit run. And we'll see the first collision I got. Let's see what data I get. We'll see that I did collided with a mesh collider called plane. So of course the first thing they did is, since they have weight and we had gravity, they collided with the plane to make sure that of course they didn't fall through. So Joe will just hit continue. We'll watch bad guy here swing his sword. Boom. So we look at the collision data, is that what we see is the collision data we get is from whoever collided with us. we don't get information about what on our mesh we got collided with. We get all the information about the, in this case, bad guy. We'll see the body of the bad guy. We can see contact points of, but they're all, we can see hand R01, which of course is his sword. And it looks like there's 3 spots on his sword that came in contact with us, but it's his sword. It tells us nothing about ourselves that I can tell from this information. So the problem is I haven't got any information about what it collided on me. Now, technically there is some contact points. If we look at these contacts, they give the point of contact, and maybe I could use that and figure out where on my body it contacted with. I didn't look into that. Seems pretty complicated, and using points and trying to map them to my position and my box size and everything, it can be pretty cumbersome. So really, sitting on the collision of the good guy may not be what we want to do. But you can see that it does give the information about who collided with what. And so maybe if I sat on the collision of the bad guy, I can tell what part of the good guy the bad guy collided with. So we can see this probably isn't going to work. So let's stop and let's back up and let's go to the bad guy with sword, add a collision to him, and see what information we get when he collides with the good guy. All right, so what we've done is I just took that same collision function from guy with sword and I pasted it into bad guy with sword. So now what we're doing is we are going to set a breakpoint here and stop, and this is on the bad guy script, and let's see if we get the information we need to determine what we hit. So let's hit go again. Of course, we first collided with the plane, so let's just hit F5 on that. Let's wait till he swings. Boom. Collision. And actually, it collided with the sword first because he swept across and obviously didn't hit his body. So we collided with hand R001. So that means it hits this guy's sword. I can't tell from the angle. So let's let it go again. Oop, he's gonna fall down. Chop. Well, that definitely hit his head. Yep, and what we see is the name of the collider was good guy. So in this case, see, the game object is good guy with sword because that's the parent, but the actual collider itself, the name was good guy. So we can see that it obviously is hitting his head and the name was good guy. Let's hit F5. Let's see if we can block that sword. I'm going to hit F5. And all right, so we put up our block, our sword collided, and we can see collision. So now we see hand R001, which means that it hit the sword instead of the guy. So now I have my information that I need, that I can check the collider's name, and if the name is R001, I can just stop the animation. But if it's good guy, that means it hit his body, and I can play the good guy's animation when he was hit. So I have the information I need on the colliders. I still have the problem with him kind of falling backward. But we'll see if we stop the sword thing, if that goes away. So that's the next problem is let's stop this. Oop, he's going to fall down. The next problem is, how do I have the good guy tell, or the bad guy, right? Because I'm in the bad guy's script. I need to tell the good guy's script to actually change his animation to the hit animation. So what I need to do is I need to communicate between the two different scripts. Now, there's a couple different ways of doing that. Let's stop him from flailing around. There's a couple different ways of doing that. One thing I can find the good guy by searching for him in the game. I can tag him and search for him by tag. I can search for him by name. Not recommended to find him by name because that can take a long time. Obviously, for this simple demonstration, that's not an issue. But if you have a big game with a lot of game objects, it's not recommended that you search by name. It's recommended you just search by tag. And once I have that game object, I can call any of that game object's functions. And so I know the function I want to do. So I'm going to put in some code to find the good guy and call a function to have him run that hit animation if it hits his body. And if it didn't, what we want to do is just reset him back to the rest position. If he had blocked the sword, we don't really know what his state is. And then what we want to do is we want to have the bad guy stop his sword swinging animation and go back to the neutral position. So let's write that code and come back and see what that looks like. All right, so let's see what we did here. So what I've done is I went in and on the guy with sword, which is the script that's attached to the good guy, I made a pretty simple function and I called it got hit. And in got hit, what I did is I set the bool got hit to true. So what that's going to do is it's going to play the got hit animation on the good guy. And of course, remember I already have this animation complete all hooked up. So if got hit is complete, it's going to set the bool back to false. Otherwise, the animation is just going to sit on that last frame if I didn't have that code in place. So I have to make sure it's public. You'll notice that some of my other ones just don't have public or private. And of course, if you don't specify functions default to private, I could put private in front of those, but a lot of times people don't. But if I want somebody else to have access to this, I have to make that function public. So my good guy has a public function that's going to run his got hit animation. Now if I go into bad guy with sword, what I did is I added a little bit of code on the collision. And so number one, anytime I have a collision, I want to, and he's swinging, I want to set that swing back to false. So what I did is I have two member variables. Scroll up here a bit. I have two booleans called swing1 and swing2. Oops, I think I have a mistake here. Didn't change that to swing2. A little copy and paste problem. But I have two variables that when I'm going to do that swing1, I'm going to set this variable boolean swing1 to true. There is ways of checking what animation I'm running, but that's more complication that I don't need. I can just add some variables to do that for me. So I have a variable doing swing 1 is true. If I'm doing swing 2, of course, doing swing 2 is true. And then I just check those. And if I have a collision, I set those appropriate swing 1 or swing 2 booleans on my animator back to false. So that will have him stop swinging and go back to that normal rest position animation. And then what I want to do is, if I've collided with the game object named good guy, I want to find, first of all, I want to find my game object, and I attached a tag called good guy in Unity to that game object. So I want to find the object with tag, and that returns an array of game objects because there could be multiple objects with that tag. In this case, I know there's only one. So I just say I want to grab the first item in the array, and then I want to get the component. And the component I want to get is the name of the script. So I type in guy with sword, which is the name of the script that is attached to him. And then as soon as I hit dot, what it's going to do is, if you're using Visual Studio, which is nice, the IntelliSense will pop up all the public functions that I could call. And in this case, I'm going to call got hit. So if we drag him off, we can see that here's my good guy. You can see that I've tagged him with the name good guy. And let's run it and see what happens. So he's going to swing, boom, and it operated exactly what I wanted to. As soon as it hit it, it reset back to 0, and my good guy went into that got hit animation, and then it reset back. Not the greatest of animations, but the mechanics are all there. It seems to be working. And let's try to see if we can block him. So he starts to swing, we press A. You'll notice that we were able to block it. We didn't play that animation because it didn't collide with the good guy's collider. But we can see that the bad guy now still, whoa, he's going to fall over. Boom. Because we're still using those colliders, and it's still interacting with that system. So that's still a problem. And we don't want him falling over, and we don't want him interacting with that physics system. We really just want to detect the collision. And so let's see if we can fix that by changing our colliders to triggers and see if we still get the information we need. All right, so what we're going to do is, instead of making a collider, let's see if we can use a trigger instead. Because triggers don't interact with the physics systems. They simply trigger the function call that we want. And it's going to be a little different. So let's go through to see how we would do that. So let's select our bad guy with sword in our mesh. Let's open the prefab. We want to go into that box collider. So we have to find our hand R01. There we go. There's our collider. Here's our box collider. And we can check this is trigger. And so now, instead of getting a collision enter, we're going to get a trigger enter. So let's go back here. Let's go and let's check out our code. So what I did is I just took everything on collision enter and I copied it to on trigger enter instead. So this won't be called. Instead of our on trigger enter is going to be called. And you'll notice before we were checking with the collision, the collider of the collision that got passed in, but trigger actually passes in the collider that it collided with, which is actually pretty handy because that's really what we want. We want to know what collider did we collide with. And so you'll notice that what I did is I just put collider.gameObject, whereas up here it's doing collision.collider.gameObject. So other GameObject name. So if I collided again, the name of the collider is good guy. I'm going to do that same code to find my good guy object and get the component and call got hit. So that's what we added to our script. So let's run it and I'll see what happens. All right. Boom. Ooh, yep. See, and now our guy, it's not doing a collider with a collider. It's just triggering our code. And so instead, it is doing exactly what we want. Nobody's moving. Nobody's falling over. Let's see if I can block it. Boom. He blocked. So he didn't do the get hit. So this is exactly what we want. I can block it. And it's not going to play the animation. Then when I'm hit, it's going to play the animation. So that's everything we wanted to do. We could go back and clean up the code. We could add that other block code. When I hit S, of course, it's going to do the other block. And I could change the randomness. How exactly you want to have the game controller choose how many different swings to do, I guess is up to you. Obviously, using this framework, you could make it as complicated as you want. You could instead, I know actually which swing I'm doing, and I know that my other guy is doing block. So you could do other types of logic just to keep track of what kind of swing he's doing and what kind of block he's doing, and add logic to say if it's swing one and block one, then it blocks. Up to you. It doesn't really take into account if you try to block too soon or too late. And they actually didn't collide. So this way it actually does a lot of work for you to figure out if the sword actually blocked the other sword. So hopefully this helps you add something else to your toolbox and figure out how characters can interact. I think for my next videos, I'm going to look into how to maybe use some of the rotation and scaling of bones in order to modify our characters instead of just doing built-in animations. And let's see what we can do with that. And again, just other tools for your toolbox, how to use armatures and in your game, both for animations, controlling armatures, controlling the animations, and doing all kinds of other things to use those armatures to help control your characters and modify your characters in a game. So if you like this video, again, give it a thumbs up and check out my other videos. If you are confused as far as how some of these other things were working, creating the animations, creating the armatures, mapping them to the meshes, I have the links in this the description of this video. If you expand that, you can see those links and follow those if you need help doing those things. But otherwise, happy gaming.